There is something you must understand before watching this video. The national Y-DNA haplogroup of the children of Yasharal is EM2, also known as E1B1A. We know this because it has 13 major subclads and 4 major associated mitochondrial haplogroups. This matches the 13 total tribes of Yasharal as well as the 4 wives of Jacob. This also is the haplogroup carried by 60% of all Black Americans. This haplogroup can be found in many places of the world, namely Africa, where the scripture tells us we would be scattered to in high numbers. In Isaiah chapter 11 verse 11 it states, "And it shall come to pass in that day that Yahuwah shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people which shall be left from Assyria, and from Mizraim, and from Pathros, and from Kush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea." Zephaniah 3 verse 10 states, "From beyond the rivers of Kush, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering." Now, one thing you must understand about the scripture is that there is a small mistranslation in this verse. The word suppliant is a person who's humble and they make an honest plea to somebody who has authority over them. However, this is not what appears in the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text gives a word that the English language doesn't really have an equivalent to. It's both a noun and kind of an adjective. The word is athar, and it literally means incense smoke. However, it also translates to something being abundant or multiplied. Because when you burn incense, the smoke is just millions of tiny particles of ash that are so light that they fly through the air. So what this scripture is basically saying is that there will be so many children of Israel coming out of the land of Kush that it's almost like incense coming out of Africa, pouring into the land of their origin. They will be abundant and they will be multiplied. It says, "Even the daughter of my dispersed shall bring mine offering." Now, the Hebraic land of Ethiopia or Kush is not limited to the borders of modern Ethiopia. The Greeks created the word Ethiopia. It meant burnt faces and referred to a large area of sub-Saharan Africa, not just the country of Ethiopia. The Hebrew word Kush is the name of one of the grandsons of Noah. The children of Kush first dwelt in Babylon. The son of Kush, Nimrod, ruled Babylon and started the first rebellion against the Almighty. For this, the language of the people were confounded into many languages, and the children of men were scattered throughout the earth. Then Yah broke apart the earth into 7 continents so that men would never be able to unify in rebellion again. Kush produced 8 different nations of people, which all had different languages, and they migrated into different regions of the world. The Nimrodites stayed in Babylon. Others, specifically the children of Havilah, migrated to the land of Midian. But the bulk of the Kushites settled along the streams of the Gihon River. In Hebrew, it means to burst forth, that is, with strength. In Jasher chapter 10 verse 9, it says that the Gihon River became a great sea, also known as Oceanus, and also bordered Western Europe. From the etymology of Gihon, we get the following: Guyana, Guyana, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Ghana. In fact, aside from most of Africa being known as Ethiopia in times of antiquity, the entire West African coast was known as Guinea, and the bordering coast was known as the Gulf of Guinea. The South Atlantic as a whole, the region between South America and West Africa, was known as the Sea of Ethiopia. Therefore, we can conclude that the Gihon River was the Atlantic Ocean before the continent split. The book of Job chapter 28 verse 19 states that the land of Kush is known for its topaz stone. Modern Ethiopia does not produce topaz, but West Africa and South America does, both in high quantities. Therefore, this territory is the most prominent land of Kush in ancient times, on both sides of the ocean. Kush languages were perhaps the most confounded compared to other nations because he was the ringleader in the construction of the Tower of Babel. Hence why South America and Africa had the most native languages per 100 square miles. If you are new here, let me just tell you that there is an astounding amount of evidence now proving that the true Holy Land of Scripture is in Western North America. Now, I know this may sound shocking at first, but when you look into the evidence, you will understand exactly what I mean. Also, evidence points to the land of Babylon to be in Quebec of Canada, and the land of Assyria to be in the southeastern territory of North America, as well as the northeastern Mississippi River Basin. If you need more proof of this, I have provided links in the description below. Before being dismissive and labeling me as a crazy person because I made these claims, I sincerely urge you to click those links below. You might just learn something. So if the Holy Land was in Western North America, how did the children of Israel even get to Africa? Instead of telling Africans their history, I will let them tell you themselves. Here's a clip of one of the subordinates of King Eri of the Igbo nation of Nigeria. He works as Eri's translator because the king himself does not speak much English.
The aura of Agleri that has maintained a dynasty. He is the 34th king in Obugad. But apart from that they have maintained this kingship and dynasty, other Israelites are equally in Igbo land. We have Zebulun, we have Ephraim, we have Menashe, we have Reuben, we have Danites. They are all here.
Nibi boss wa apotabo sinakeri gade bum Israel mo Israel is no wa mo ba Israel na Israel bu nwanne ibada n'elu ni Yoruba ma iba si wa apota Hausa ma iba si wa apota na bu no nwa ibada n'elu na aga ina eme ngala no nwa Chineke ke bu.
You walk with pride.
Hey,
because you are a child of Adonai.
Chineke gozi o na ba ya go.
Na Adonai bless us.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Igbos are Israelites. The question of Igbo being Israelites are not in doubt. There are evidences that Igbos are Israelites. The journey of Igbo started when the Assyrians actually attacked and exiled the 10 tribes of Israel, the Northern Kingdom, in 722 BCE. From that period, all the 10 tribes were scattered. The bulk, according to Mazutra, were taken to Africa.
Now one might say, King Eri learned this from YouTube. But no, this is a king we're talking about, of the Eri dynasty, a very ancient Nigerian dynasty, by the way, and this knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Even the name of his dynasty is the name of an Israelite in the scriptures, Eri, the son of Gad.
Okay, so sir, please can you tell us the history behind the statues at the back there?
Good. What you are saying is Obugad. Obugad is the first Igbo hut. It was built by Eri and his two brothers, Eri, Arodi, and Arel. They built this hut. And what we do is to renovate. And when you look at it, it's mud house, only brushed with cement. Eri, Arodi, and Arel built this place in the remembrance of their father God. So,
as you can see, the Yoruba people, specifically the Igbo, claim to be of the 10 tribes who went to West Africa from Assyria. This is their words, not mine. They do not claim to be aboriginal to Africa, nor do they claim to be those who fled the Romans in 70 AD. The Igbo people are a Niger-Congo speaking people of the Yoruba family. Igbo comes from the word corruption of Ibri or Hebrew. Yoruba comes from the Hebrew name Yerubam or Jeroboam, which was the first king of the divided kingdom of Yasra'al. Thus, it wouldn't be hard to believe that eventually certain people of the 10 tribes referred to themselves as the kingdom of Jeroboam, which eventually became known as the kingdom of the Yoruba. But the real question is, if the Yorubas came from Assyria, which is in the Middle East, why are they in the opposite side of Africa? Did these people sail from the Persian Gulf just to land all the way on the opposite side of Africa by going all the way around the continent when they could have just settled in the Horn of Africa or somewhere else in East Africa or maybe even Southern Africa, which at the time was practically unpopulated by humans? That would be a nice place for them to go. But no, they decided to go all the way around to the west coast of Africa to settle there. Something just doesn't seem right. Now, the second group of Yasra'alim found in Africa are the Bantus. This is what the Bantus of Zimbabwe have to say about their origins. This is a clip from Gari Kai Tirioki, who was born into a Shona traditional healer's family in Chihota rural area of Zimbabwe.
I know about Chaminuga. It's a long story of Chaminuga. Chaminuga's body was surviving in Persia. Do you know Persia?
Yes.
That's where most black people came from. Because these southern countries were not having people, they was just forest. The time people began to travel, they came from Persia. They was led by the voice of a bird which was flying. That bird was showing them directions to go and the rules of praying to the ancestors to stop.
Gary Kaye is a highly educated and accredited elder of the Shona people. He's not the only Bantu who says this either. This is a well-known origin story throughout the southeastern region of Africa. As you can see, the Bantu elders claim to have come from Persia. Again, not Africa or the Levant, but Persia, which was in the same geographical location of Babylon, just under a new title because it was conquered. Chaminuka was a renowned ancestor of the Southern Bantu tradition, and he was considered to be a prophet with Elijah or Elisha-like qualities. His family and the other Bantus were said to have migrated from the north, specifically from Persia and into the interior of tropical Africa, eventually building the Great Zimbabwe. We know that when the Israelites were in the Persian captivity, we were still in the geographical location of Babylon. But because Darius and eventually Cyrus conquered Babylon, it was under new management and therefore became known as Persia. Therefore, if the Bantus are truly Israelites from the Persian captivity, they must have left the land of Babylon. However, given the fact that their oral tradition also points to their origin in the hinge of West Africa, as well as archaeological evidence points to their origins in the hinge of West Africa, they could not have truly came from Persia unless Persia was somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, instead of modern-day Iran. Back in the land, the children of Yasra'al completely forsook Yahuwah, and in mass they worshipped idols and practiced sorceries and burned their babies alive in fire. Around 750 BCE, the Ashuri, also known as the Assyrians, under the command of Tiglath-Pileser, went forth over all their rivers and marched forth over all their streams for a great distance in conquest. Then with bloodshed and conquest on their mind, they spread themselves abroad the mountains of Yasra'al. During the days of Pekah, king of Yasra'al, the Ashuri took captives the Gadites and the Manassites and the Naphtalites and brought them into Assyria, a land of dread and fear. Many nations knew of the cruelty of the Assyrian, how they tortured, skinned, and burned to death anyone who rebelled against them. Then several years passed, and a new king in Samaria had just been coronated by wicked means. Hoshea, the son of Elah, killed Pekah, king of Yasharal, to take his throne. In those days, Yasharal was a tributary to Assyria, and when Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, presented himself before Hoshea, Hoshea gave him gifts. He was expected to give the king of Assyria gifts year by year, but in the following years, he sent gifts to the king of Mizraim instead of Assyria, even though Yasharal was no tributary to Mizraim, nor did the king of Mizraim even ask for gifts from Yasharal. Shalmaneser interpreted this as Hoshea's way of making an alliance with Mizraim to join forces and take down Assyria. Therefore, Shalmaneser acted quickly and returned to Samaria and imprisoned Hoshea for treason. And again, the Assyrians spread themselves abroad the mountains of Yasharal and took captives. The tribes of Yasharal went into captivity, except for Judah, Benjamin, and Simeon, as well as a portion of the Levites, those who dwelt in the center of the land. These were the only tribes of Yasharal that Yahuwah protected from the yoke of the Assyrian. After being forced to walk 1,000 miles within a few months to their cities of their captivity, they would have been treated unimaginably cruel by their new masters. Assyria was so terrifying that no messenger was sent to Assyria to instruct the children of Yasharal like messengers were sent during the later Babylonian and Persian captivities. Approaching the borders of Assyria was almost like a death sentence. In fact, the only prophet who blatantly disobeyed the Almighty yet was still blessed and protected was Jonah. And that's because y'all understood why Jonah was so terrified to go there. Yahuwah told Jonah to go to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and warn them. But Jonah was so terrified that he fled away in the complete opposite direction, displaying exactly what a true monster of a society the Assyrians were at the time, and they were known for it. There is no mention of the children of Yasharal ever returning from the land of Assyria in ancient times. However, scripture only indicates them returning from Assyria in the last days. Isaiah 11:16. And there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Mizraim. If we were to look at the context of Isaiah chapter 11, anyone would be able to come to the conclusion that the chapter is speaking of the last days when the diaspora all around the world will return in the land and rule in righteousness, peace, and perfection under David, the everlasting king. I will not go into that in this video, but if you would like to get off of this video for a second and read Isaiah chapter 11, you may. So what types of jobs did the Hebrews have when they were enslaved in Assyria? We must first know what was Assyria's major industry. Ezekiel 31:4 states that the rivers made him great and the deep set him on high, which indicates that most of their economy was based off of the rivers and the ocean. From the rivers they harvested fish and maintained their agriculture. From the seas they harvested fish and set sail to trade with far-off nations. How do we know that Assyria got on ships and sailed to far-off lands? Out of the caves of Bolivia and Brazil, there have been discovered many Assyrian artifacts which were in the Crespi collection. They were placed in a museum that was eventually burned down, allegedly by the Smithsonian Institution. But the reason why the Assyrian artifacts were found in South America is because of trade. We know that the Middle Eastern Assyrians did not come to the Americas. Any theory that states that they did are completely ridiculous and can be easily debunked. For one, the distance from Iraq to South America is literally half the circumference of the earth, and a desert-dwelling people in 2000 BC would not have the skill to accomplish a feat that not even the ocean-dwelling Polynesians could accomplish. But if the true land of Assyria is in southeastern America, they would only have to follow the path of the Caribbean archipelago into South America, a journey that only takes 2 weeks. Also in South America, specifically Peru, a Sumerian artifact known as the Fuente Magna Bowl was discovered accidentally by a farmer. The text on the bowl can be directly translated into a Sumerian message about making oaths and libations to a goddess. Also, in the King of Battle epic, it states that Sargon, king of Assyria, conquered a land across the sea known as Anaku, which translates to 10 lands. To this day, no one knows exactly where Anaku is, but it could have been in Huanaco, Peru, Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, or even Anaku, Nigeria, all of which have high tin production. There is nowhere in the Mediterranean or the entire Middle East known as Anaku. Anaku, Nigeria actually has some evidence, as even until the days of Columbus, metals from Africa were traded with the Amerindians. But the Africans who traded the guanine metal with the Amerindians were most likely more recent inhabitants of Africa, and also from Assyria, as according to the University of California, Riverside, Sumerian is related to the Mende languages of West Africa. I wonder why. We'll get to that in just a minute. So again, what types of jobs did the Hebrews have when they were enslaved in Assyria? Most of them would have either worked the harbor or the rivers and farms. But due to the fact that the Ashuri were a very cruel people towards their subjects, slave rebellions and revolts were imminent. Due to the fight or flight response in all humans, when a slave is being put in intense life or death situations every day of his life, he will either revolt or flee away. Countries which had the worst treatment of their slaves are the same countries whose slaves ended up rebelling, such as Haiti, Jamaica, and many other Caribbean islands, as well as Iraq during the Zanj Rebellion in the 9th century AD. So there would have been several slave revolts against the Ashuri, but the Ashuri were stronger. So many of the children of Yasharal would have ended up doing what Jonah did, fleeing into the sea, as they had no other option. What would have helped them is the fact that they already had experience working the harbors and in the ships anyway. Deuteronomy 28 and 25. Yahuwah shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and shall be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. So what parts of the earth did we flee into? Many would have fled into the Caribbean and South America. We know this because almost all the islands of the Caribbean have a Hebrew affinity. Cuba comes from the Hebrew word kuba, which means vaulted tent, probably because of how its palm forests form a roof-like canopy over the ground. The people of Cuba called themselves the Habana people, hence the name of the country's capital city today. Habana means the hidden ones, or the hidden people. Haba is Hebrew for hide, and Na is a Sumerian suffix meaning people or person. This indicates that the Aboriginal people of Cuba were perhaps hiding from persecution of a greater tribe on the mainland. Also the Bahamas, which Bahama is a Hebrew word meaning animals, probably because the Bahamas are home to many previously unknown endemic animals. But because Cuba and the Bahamas are very close to Assyria, most of the other refugees wanted to get as far away as possible, so they went to other islands. Jamaica, for example, was originally pronounced Shamika by the natives. This means roughly, our mouths were heard. Ka is a Sumerian suffix which means mouth. Shema is a Hebrew word that means to listen or to hear. Haiti's name probably came from the Sumerian Hatti, which is the Mesopotamian name for the land of Canaan. Thus, the people of Haiti were probably saying that they came from the Hatti land or Canaan. The Puerto Ricans called themselves Borinquen, or the blessed nobles. Barak is the Hebrew word for blessed. Een is the Sumerian suffix which means nobles. Also, many fled into South America. But the most popular legend of the Assyrian Israelite exiles is the one found in the second book of Esdras. As many of us know, first and second Esdras are either fraudulent or at least highly tampered with, but that doesn't make 100% of the text false, as there is some truth in pretty much everything. In the second book of Esdras, chapter 13 and verse 40, it states that the 10 tribes that were taken by the Assyrians eventually got together to flee Assyria by entering into the narrow streams of the Euphrates, which is really the Mississippi River, and entering into the sea. According to that account, Yah made the waves of the waters calm for the children of Yasharal so that they can enter into their destination safely, and also showed them many signs of the path which they should go. They then entered a land that no man dwelt. The text says never man dwelt. In Hebrew, the word never and no are the same word, Allah. Humans lived in all parts of the earth at some point, according to the book of Genesis chapter 11 verse 8. So it should say where no man dwells. This land would have been the Western Sahara Desert because it contained a pocket of land that no one lives in even to this day. We know that the Sahara Desert used to be green and inhabited at this time, but not the western part. The Sahara Desert began to grow from the west to the east as Lake Chad and its adjoining river basins dried up. However, the western side of the Sahara Desert has always been a wasteland, or at least for the last few thousand years. But it wasn't a complete desert as it is today. What is now the Western Sahara was a dry savanna back then. Today, the greatest expanse of non-populated land on Earth outside of the poles is the Sahara Desert. But as a side note, there even used to be an area in northern Algeria literally called Arsareth. In Hebrew, the word Arsareth literally means other land or other earth, which indicates that this is probably on an entirely different continent. The book goes on to say once they entered the country, it took them a year and a half to reach their final destination. This tells me that they must have landed somewhere north of the Senegal River, in the vicinity of the southernmost border of Mauritania. The name Senegal comes from Hebrew roots. The word Senegal originally was Zanaga. Zana means well-fed or fat in Hebrew. Ga is probably short for Gan, which means garden in Hebrew, perhaps showing the excitement of them finally seeing a green riverbank after traveling through this desert. For survival, they would have probably journeyed along the Senegal River for quite some time for adequate supply of fish and water. That path would have led them southward into Guinea. With constant migration for about a year and a half, they would have reached the land now known as Yoruba land, which is located on the hinge of West Africa. Unfortunately, new life in this land would be far from easy. They were not alone. Once they reached Yoruba land, they had to fight the native inhabitants. These ancient Hamites fought hand and nail with the children of Yasharal, but suffered many humiliating defeats. Scientists call these early Hamites the Iwo Elaru people. The large slash-like cracks and arrow holes in their skulls indicate merciless defeats in brutal warfare. They were gradually replaced by the children of Yasharal as they settled in Yoruba land. Between wars, the two groups intermarried, which fused their languages, customs, and genetics together. The wars persisted, and as time went on, the children of Yasharal in West Africa gained new sets of enemies. The most recent are the modern-day Hausa and Fulani peoples, who are historical enemies of the Yoruba people. But in ancient times, when the Hebrews showed up on the coast of West Africa, very quickly they replaced the native inhabitants of West Africa by both war and intermarriage. By this, they multiplied greatly in number. Understand that Yah had to curse his people for disobedience, but he also had to keep his promise at the same time. His promise stated that the children of Yasharal should be as the sand of the sea and as the stars of the heaven. So, in order to do that, in some areas, he made us multiply abundantly, but in other areas, he made us few among the heathen. As you can see in this scripture, even in the day that Yah said we are not his people, we will still be as the sand of the sea without measure. In Genesis chapter 49, verse 22, it states, Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Yasharal. As you can see, this prophecy matches the Yoruba peoples to the T. For one, the Yoruba peoples have the largest range of high population densities in Africa, with Nigeria having the highest population of all the countries in Africa. Nigeria also is the country where women have the highest chance of giving birth to twins in the entire world. This is why they are called a fruitful bow. It also says that his branches go all over the wall, which indicates that the children of Joseph will have many territories that they will be scattered to. Verse 23 talks about archers shooting arrows against him, but the children of Joseph eventually overcome and defeat their enemies, which literally happened when the ancestors of the Yoruba came into contact with the West African natives. Besides the claim made by the Igbo that they are descendants of the Yasraelim from Assyria, what other evidence do we have that they even came into contact with ancient Assyrians? First off, the Yoruba people who dwelt particularly in Nigeria have many similarities of customs, cultures, and traditions as the ancient Sumerian cultures such as the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Both Nigerians and Sumerians lived in mud and thatched or reed huts. They worshiped gods in small shrines, and they made sacrifices of livestock and food for their gods. They practiced animism, worshiping deities of the waters, earth, wind, and vegetation. Families ate meals from a common plate, and like many Nigerians and other Africans, they scooped food with their bare hands. Sumerians and Nigerians were metal workers and farmers. Both peoples practiced arranged marriages. Both peoples made soap with a mixture of wood ash and oil. Both Sumerians and ancient Nigerian chiefs dressed customarily in wrappers slung across the left shoulder with the right shoulder bare. Chiefs of both people wore cornelian beads on their neck. The chief goddess of the Sumerians literally has the same name as the chief goddess of the Yoruba. The Sumerian goddess and the Yoruba goddess birthed the moon in their tradition. There's no way two unrelated cultures could come to such similar conclusions unless they had some type of contact with each other. On top of that, the languages are similar. About 95% of all the words in the Assyrian or Akkadian language end in the U or E sound, but especially the U sound. In fact, in the Assyrian language, if a word doesn't end in U or E, the word would stand out in the text as it is a rarity. The Igbo language is similar, but still has many other ending sounds which formed as the language began to evolve and diverge over time. In Akkadian, lion is Akulu. In Igbo, it is Agu. Meat in Akkadian is Ablu. In Igbo, it is Anu. Sky in Sumerian is Anu, and sun in Igbo is Anwu. Earth in Akkadian is Uwa. Earth in Igbo is Arwa. Now, of course, these words are different, but one can clearly see how the Akkadian words morphed into Igbo words over time. One very interesting thing I like to point out is that the earliest known society of West Africa is the Nok culture of Nigeria, which started around 500 BCE. Now, the Assyrian captivity of the children of Yasharal started in 722 BCE, which means that the Nok culture of Nigeria started 200 years after the Assyrian captivity, which puts it in a perfect time span for this theory to be correct. Today, there is a group of Yoruba Jews who call themselves B'nai Ephraim and believe that they are descendants of Ephraim who escaped from the Assyrian captivity around 700 BCE. And the Anang, Efik, and Ibibayo peoples also have ancient religious practices similar to those found in the Torah. Today, West Africans wear some of the most beautiful and colorful garments in the world in honor of their ancestor Joseph. Adamu was an early king in ancient Assyria and also the name of the first man in the Sumerian mythology. However, in today's time, Adamu is a surname found only on the continent of Africa. The surname Adamu is very common in Nigeria, and it means the same thing that it means in Sumerian, father of mankind. Also, the eastern border of Nigeria lies a land known as Adamawa, an etymological derivation of Adamu. Hosea chapter 4 verse 17 states, Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. Their drink is sour, they have committed whoredom continually. Her rulers with shame do love. Give ye, the wind hath bound her up in her wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. This verse tells us that the children of Ephraim, which is the children of Joseph, are very guilty of idol worship as well as sacrifices to those idols. And as a result, it says the wind hath bound her up in their wings, which means they're going to be scattered. They're going to be taken and removed from their land and brought to other regions of the earth. And it also says they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Because of their sacrifices, which they sacrificed unto other gods, they went into captivity. They went into a strange land where they will suffer from disease, famine, oppression, and enslavement. To this day, the Yoruba peoples are huge idol worshippers, worshiping the idols of Kush, as well as some of the same idols of Assyria and of their forefathers. But human sacrifice was also a big deal in Yoruba culture and even still goes on illegally under the rug in Nigeria today. This is truly what these scriptures are prophesying. We have to understand one of the main reasons why Yah did not want us to worship other gods is because ancient polytheistic religions always involved human sacrifice in some way or another. It wasn't until monotheistic religion, Abrahamic religion, came about that human sacrifice became banned around the world. Thank Yah. Deuteronomy 28:36 states, Yahuwah shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And there thou shalt serve other gods, wood and stone. This is talking about Africa. It's very obvious. In Africa, these are some of the only people in the world who worship gods exclusively made out of wood and stone. A lot of people correlate the scripture with Christianity and Islam, with Christianity being the wood and Islam being the stone, but these are too symbolic. This curse is literal and it applies to West Africans. Now that we have discussed the Yoruba peoples, what about their neighbors to the south, the Bantus? First off, Bantu is a language group, not an ethnic group, but the language was spread by an ethnic group, who we will for the sake of this video call the Bantus. The Yoruba and the Bantus are both the same people genetically, but are different in many other ways. Both groups inhabited the same region of West Africa at one point, but the Bantu did not want to settle there and separated themselves from the Yoruba and spread south into the rainforest of Central Africa. The Bantus were a nation of conquest. They conquered roughly 1/3 of all Africa, destroying practically anyone who stood against them in war. They multiplied their seed abundantly. The Bantus were archaic Israelites who loved this new land with a passion and took as much of it as possible. Prior to the Hebrew invasion of Africa, the continent was almost completely empty in population. The children of Kush and other Hamites were the only people who lived in this gigantic continent. They only lived in small pockets of the entire surface area, but most of Africa was unmanned and uncivilized, and therefore the beasts of the field multiplied very greatly. This is why Africa has the highest population of wild, large animals, because there was not that many people there historically to ever hunt them down like in other continents. Scientists estimate the beginning of the Bantu expansion to be about 4,000 to 2,000 years ago. But we know that scientific estimates are normally a little bit older than they truly are due to carbon dating, but this one is very close. They estimate it to be between 4,000 to 2,000 years ago, but we can estimate it to be about 2,500 years given the fact that these are Israelites from the lands of their captivity. The earliest part of the Bantu expansion was actually the Yoruba peoples who spread from Cameroon into the Congo. When I say Yoruba, I'm not literally only talking about the Yoruba people. I'm actually referring to all E1B1A Niger-Congo speaking people from West Africa, from the Senegal River to the Congo River. The Yoruba culture just so happens to be one of the oldest cultures descended from the Nok culture of Nigeria, but these people did start the expansion, but only spread through a piece of the Congo though. And the rest of the Bantu expansion came from a second set of Jews who entered into the continent of Africa, also crossing the Atlantic from America. So how did they get into the land of Africa? Well, now we have to go all the way back to the days of Jeremiah around 586 BCE in Jerusalem. The children of Judah were sinning and doing wickedness greatly in the land at that time, and many of them went down into the valley of Hinnom and sacrificed their babies to the gods as well. Therefore, Yah sent the Babylonians against them, and they went into captivity. Now, the Babylonians were harsh and cruel, just like the Assyrian, but not nearly as much. In fact, they were actually pretty lenient on the children of Judah, who they captured, and their captivity was not that rough. The captivity lasted only 70 years, and after the end of the 70 years, Babylon was now called Persia. And Cyrus, king of Persia, let the children of Judah return back to their homeland. But that doesn't mean they all wanted to return. Many of them decided to stay in Babylon. In fact, a majority of them decided to stay in Babylon because of his great wealth and abundance, as well as their feeling of safety and security. That's why Zechariah wrote to them after the Yehudim were freed, saying, Ho ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, saith Yahuwah. For I have spread you abroad as the four winds of heaven, saith Yahuwah. Deliver thyself, O Zion, that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. This was a warning to the Yehudim who decided to stay in Babylon to flee because of the great destruction that was coming. What type of destruction was coming upon Babylon? Well, Isaiah chapter 13 talks about that in great detail. The book of Isaiah 13 says, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see. Lift ye up a banner upon the high mountain, exalt the voice unto them, shake the hand, that they may go into the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have called my mighty ones for mine anger, even them that rejoice in my highness. The noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms and nations gathered together. Yahuwah of hosts mustered the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even Yahuwah, and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Howl ye, for the day of Yahuwah is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt, and they shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. Behold, the day of Yahuwah cometh. cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. And I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man more than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens and the earth and remove her out of her place in the wrath of Yahuwah of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger. Isaiah 13 is specifically about the destruction of Babylon. There will be multiple stages to this destruction. The first stage appears to be Yah summoning his angels of destruction to the earth for a specific reason, and they will cause the mountains to tremble like the noise of a multitude of nations gathered together. The destruction of Babylon is referred to as the day of the Lord. It then states that not only will Babylon suffer, but the world in general will also be punished. The sky will be blackened and the stars will not be visible, nor the moon. It states that the earth itself will shake and be removed out of its place. One might think, oh, this chapter is actually about the day of the Lord that will happen at the end of the world. This isn't about ancient Babylon. But no, the first verse and verse 19 to 22 of this chapter clearly tells us that this is specifically about the destruction of ancient Babylon. Then, how would the whole world be affected? Well, in 536 AD, there was a huge divide in the mid-Atlantic ridge that separated the western and the eastern hemisphere even more. This resulted in eruption of an extreme amount of volcanoes in the Atlantic Ocean, with most of them occurring in Iceland. The smoke from the eruption covered practically the whole world, specifically the northern hemisphere, causing extreme darkness over the world for more than a whole entire year. This caused extreme famines, ice storms, and sickness all that year. This year became known as the worst year in history. This catastrophe killed between 35 and 55% of all the people in the newly fallen Roman Empire, making this event have a higher death rate than even the bubonic plague. It was also known as the Late Antiquity Little Ice Age, or the Lalia period, because the volcanic clouds were so thick that they completely prevented sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. The Lalia period lasted 100 years, but peaked for 43 years from 536 to 579 AD. In the beginning, glaciers began to form in all the high mountains in the northern hemisphere. When the peak of the Lalia period was completely over and the Earth began to return back to its normal warm temperature in 579 to 589, all these glaciers rapidly melted, flooding all the adjacent lowlands and valleys in Europe and eastern Canada. A historian by the name of Paul the Deacon described this disaster as an event that was not supposed to happen after the days of Noah. The waters of Europe were so high that even the walls of Rome overflowed with water, meaning the water level was so high that it was even higher than the high walls that surrounded the city of Rome. The roof of every building was completely submerged underwater. Then the very first bubonic plague spread through Europe, claiming even more lives. If you think that's bad, imagine how bad it was in Quebec. Quebec is naturally colder than Europe, so imagine how much colder it was during the Lalia period. Quebec's glaciers would be a lot thicker, and therefore its glacial melts would be a lot more intense. Quebec has the most lakes on Earth, mostly due to the rapid flooding of the melting glaciers during the Lalia. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos, proving Quebec is the true territory of ancient Babylon, I advise you to check that out after this video. This is how Isaiah 14, the very next chapter, describes how Babylon should look after its destruction. Isaiah 14 and 22. For I will raise up against them, saith Yahuwah of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name, and the remnant, and the son, and the nephew, saith Yahuwah, and I will make it a possession for bittern, and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, saith Yahuwah of hosts. There are many things that I would like to point out here. In verse 22, it states that Yah will cut off from Babylon the name, which means Babylon would not be known as Babylon anymore. Also, it says he will cut off the son and the nephew, which means many people will die. It states in verse 23 that Babylon will be full of pools of water at the end of its destruction. The entire country of Iraq only has 10 lakes, but the area associated with Babylon has a few swamps. But that's to be expected because it's a river delta. Eastern Canada, on the other hand, has more lakes than anywhere else on Earth. It also is home to several types of bittern, notably the American bittern as well as the least bittern. Yah said he will sweep Babylon with the besom of destruction. Besom means a broom. As the glaciers slid down the mountains into the sea, it caused deep scratches and streaks in the landscape as if Yah took a broom and literally swept Quebec. But it also says the remnant should be cut off from Babylon. Is that talking about the remnant of Judah who was brought to Babylon and decided not to return? Most likely not. Yah never allowed natural disasters to wipe out large quantities of his people. This is what he promised his people. Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 2. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. Therefore, when it says remnant, it's most likely referring to the Babylonians who remained in the land after the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon. It's important to understand that the Empire of Babylon was conquered around 537 BC and became known as Persia from that point on. This is what most likely happened to the Israelites who remained in Persia far after their captivity ended. The children of Judah who were in Persia would have migrated south due to the temperatures of the land. From there, they would have reached Assyria. By this time, the Assyrian Empire would have fallen, and all the Hebrews who inhabited Western North America would have migrated into Assyria. So they were not the only Israelites or even Judites in the land. By this time, also, the traditional Hebrew apparel was abandoned centuries before, and the average American Israelite adorned themselves with feathers upon the head, perhaps after the tradition of the Persians or the Mesoamerican people who migrated from the land into the southern region of the United States. But the Ice Age is still affecting them harshly. Because the Lalia affected the entire northern hemisphere for about 100 years, they probably decided to venture even further south. Many of them also into the Caribbean and South America, but some of them also into Africa like the nation of Israel did 1,000 years before. There was definitely trade between the West African people and the Americans who dwelt on the east coast of America around that time. Ancient pre-Columbian pottery was found in Nigeria, which displays the imprint of American maize, which was simply rolled over the surface of the clay for decoration. Archaeologists also claim to have uncovered pre-Columbian grindstones in Africa with maize residue still on them. Then there's the Mande oral tradition of maize. The Mande people of West Africa claim to have had two varieties of American maize long before European contact. We know maize originated in America because its wild ancestor, teosinte, still grows in Mexico today. A variety of American cotton was also cultivated in West Africa. Richard A. Fields writes in his book, Ancient American, 30 years before the first Columbian expedition to the New World. The Portuguese were supposed to have replanted cotton from their colonies at Guinea in the Cape Verde Islands. But late 20th century botanists discovered that the genetic composition of the Cape Verde cotton was not indigenous to coastal West Africa. Instead, it was cultivated by Native Americans in the Caribbean. How did it get to Africa before Columbus? They marveled. Oral traditions for both the American Indians as well as West Africans indicated that there was a trade in ancient times between Africa and the Americas. Prominent Arab historians like Abu Sa'id Utham and Ibn Battuta, for example, wrote that West African oral traditions describe transatlantic voyages from Ghana as early as the 9th century BC. Diani Yawu, a member of the Eastern Zalaki, or Cherokee traditional Etowah band, stated, "Our ancestors told me long before the white men made their appearances upon the shores of Turtle Island, other visitors had came a long time ago, black peoples from Africa." As we can see, there is evidence of back and forth trade from the Americas into Africa and vice versa in pre-Columbian times. The children of Israel seem to have had communications with each other, even when they were scattered from captivity. But during the Lalia period, they would have communicated about the recent climate change to make accommodations for their crop trades. When the Americans learned that Africa was still hot and warm at this time, many of them probably decided to cross the sea and enter into West Africa for survival, as there was an extreme deficit in the crop production of North America. By the time the second fleet of Americans made it to Africa, the Bantu expansion was already halfway completed. Many of the Yoruba peoples pushed deep into the Congo, though the people who started the original migrations of the Bantu expansion were not technically true Bantus. That would be the second fleet of Americans who recently came from America, fleeing from the Persian captivity during the Lalia period. These were the feather and skin wearing Bantus, in contrast to the colorful robe and head wrap wearing Yoruba people of West Africa. This second fleet of Americans who made it to Africa did not want to permanently integrate with West African Yoruba society. For one, their customs and cultures were completely different. This second fleet of Americans wore feathers on their heads and had a language that the Yoruba people barely found understandable. The Bantu language and the Yoruba language are related, but that doesn't mean that the everyday communication was easy between the two groups. Both languages had Hebraic roots in certain words, and both languages had Sumerian roots in certain words. However, the difference takes place when we consider the indigenous roots from the outsiders who would have came into contact with the Yorubas versus the outsiders who came into contact with the ancestors of the Bantus from America. That's what makes the languages completely different from each other. But just the difference in wardrobe made the two groups of people look like completely different people. The Persian Bantu completed the expansion. They pushed very far south and east into Africa, conquering Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, parts of South Africa, Kenya, and more. What gave the Yoruba and Bantus an advantage over the indigenous Kushites of Africa, allowing them to spread over the land, take over, and become a mighty nation? These archaic Israelites were the first people in non-Nilotic sub-Saharan Africa who had iron tools, stone masonry, clay pottery, and agriculture. Not to mention, they were also excellent in war, so excellent that hunter-gatherers and pygmies who roamed the small pockets of Africa stood absolutely no chance against them. The Zulus are amongst those Bantus, and we know that the Zulu warriors were so powerful in war that the British had to team up with other African tribes just to take them down. So if the Zulu were this close to defeating the British army, How successful do you think they were against the simple hunter-gatherers who had limited knowledge of war at all? The average warrior amongst them took a plethora of wives from amongst the indigenous population and spread their seed abundantly. The Bantu expansion stopped in East Africa along the Nile River because they found it difficult to conquer the very tall Nilotic people of East Africa, who are larger than them and also were excellent in war, had stone masonry and iron tools as well. However, to this day, the Nilotic people despise the Bantus. Here's what one Nilote has to say.
I like this comment right here. To keep the Nilotic race pure and not mix with Bantus. We as Nilotic people shouldn't mix with Bantu West Africans and Bantu Central Africans that settled in East Africa. We have royal melanin and royal bloodline that needs to get kept sacred from these Bantu peoples and untouched, especially for us Luo peoples. So these Bantu West Africans and Central Africans need to go back to West and Central Africa so we don't get our melanin and bloodline diluted by these Bantu peoples. These Bantu people go around and marry anybody. That's why they have a massive amount of population in a small period of time. They even send women out to go marry other tribes and other people in Africa. They hate their genes. We as Nilotic peoples need to reclaim all of our countries in East Africa and North Africa and keep our royal bloodline going as Nilotic peoples.
Although this guy is clearly racist, he's not completely wrong. Bantus and Niger-Congo people have an extreme amount of children on average. The truth is, African Hebrew men are either polygynous or promiscuous, especially if he has the financial means to support more. In fact, it is said that Islam was vigorously attempted to be spread through West Africa, not to give men an excuse to take multiple women, but to regulate the amount of women they could have, as Islam commands that men can only have at most 4 wives. And for this, some Niger-Congo people would refuse to convert to Islam because they wanted way more than just 4 wives. To some of those tribes, the idea of having 1 wife is simply equivalent to being poor, and it's never something that somebody should want in life. Take a look at this map. It is a very detailed map of every single Y chromosome haplogroup on Earth. As we look at Africa, we can see that there are several different nations living in Africa today, but the largest haplogroup is the brown color that we see in the west and central region of Africa. The brown color is haplogroup EM2 or E1B1A, the haplogroup of the children of Yasharal. Now let's pan over to the Americas. As you can see, that brown color is very small in population and is only focused primarily on the eastern side of the Americas, in both North, Central, and South. Though in South America and Central Mexico, there are some prominent locations where EM2 can be found primarily on the western side of the coast, so it would make little sense for them to be descendants of the slave trade from Africa. They probably were already there. When Western North America became desert and eventually flooded, all the inhabitants of Western North America migrated towards the east and towards the south, including the children of Yasharal. This parallels to many Native American oral tradition. Many of them claim that their ancestors migrated across the Mississippi River but originated in Western North America. The same tribes had Hebraic practices and claimed to have been the creators of the Bible. They claim to have had a powerful kingdom in the West that was destroyed by God because of their sin. The reason why there are far more Israelites in Africa than the Americas is simple. Let's let the scriptures speak first, shall we? Micah chapter 4 verse 7. And I will make her that halted a remnant, and her that was cast far off a strong nation. And Yahuwah shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. In reference to the children of Yasharal, Yah said that he would make her that is halted a remnant, but the ones that were cast far off a strong nation. What does that mean? Well, halt means to be still, to stay, or to stop. This means the children of Yasharal who stayed on the same side of the earth that they originated on will be a remnant. But the Yasharalim who were cast far off, specifically overseas, will become a strong nation. This is why the population of Israelites in Africa is huge. In fact, Israelites are around half the total population of Africa, and Africa will be nearly emptied during the second Exodus. This is how we know that that tiny little area in the Middle East is not the true land of Israel. The total population of Yasharal on earth is more than 800 million. That's 88 times the population of modern Israel, which is already overpopulated, by the way. If 800 million people went to the Middle Eastern Israel, they would simply strip the land of its scant resources within a month. This is also how we know the Holy Land is not in Africa, because the children of Israel is not a remnant in Africa, but are in America. Many people don't know that the bubonic plague was spread from the Europeans to the indigenous population of America. The bubonic plague ended in Europe in 1353 because the remaining population of the Europeans gained immunity to the disease. The disease wiped out 50% of Europe's population, but the Europeans afterwards still carried the disease, but just somewhat had immunity to it. So when they settled amongst the indigenous people of the Americas only 200 years later, the bubonic plague plus the smallpox epidemic wiped out 90% of the America's indigenous population, as they had no immunity to these diseases. Luckily, the Europeans at that time were deathly afraid to go deep inland into Africa at this time, as they traded with them from the coast. As far as making permanent settlements in Africa, they only began to do so in the 1800s. This gave sub-Saharan Africa plenty of time to build more immunity to the new European diseases. Haplogroup E in general was introduced to sub-Saharan Africa due to the Assyrian and Persian Israelite exiles. The autochthonous haplogroups of Africa were A and B. That's it. C was in Asia, Australia, and America, and D was in East India. So why would E develop in Africa if its closest genetic relatives live elsewhere? Haplogroup E is not even related to the African haplogroups of A and B. The southern and eastern Bantu still wears the same feathers and animal skins that the American Aboriginal was known for. This is because these are some of the most recent black inhabitants of Africa. They claim to have originated from Persia and most likely settled in the new continent in the 6th century AD during the Lalia period. But their farthest settlements could have been even more so recent. In a book entitled Origins of Rhodesia, which is about the detailed history of Zimbabwe region, it states that the first Bantu-speaking peoples may have settled in the Great Zimbabwe region as late as the 1st millennium AD or the 1000s. This also corresponds with the oral tradition of Chaminuka, a great warrior and prophet who was said to have been one of the builders of the Great Zimbabwe. If the Great Zimbabwe was constructed in the 11th century AD, that corresponds with the aforementioned date of the arrival of the first Bantus in Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe is simply their most recent home. Their land of origin is in North America, and because of great famine caused by the Lalia period, they crossed the Atlantic and entered West Africa and settled the entire continent. On the southeastern coast of ancient Assyria, they built ships to escape this newly fruitless land. Their trade with West Africa proved to them that this land was fruitful, and thus they adjusted their sails and set their eye to that great land that lies to the southeast. Aside from basic human survival, human curiosity may have been a huge motivation as well. Israelites were historically excellent seafarers and knew that they had to take the Gulf Stream current northeast before going south into Africa. The sight of birds and dolphins let them know that they are approaching land. After about 3 weeks, they spot a lush green coastline. Many of them settle in the territory already inhabited by the ancient Yorubas, a peaceful land. Where their wives and their daughters can rest peacefully for once. Others continue to push southeast to claim land of their own. There they discovered endless land with no civilization in sight, and wild beasts as far as the eye can see, both the clean and the unclean alike. The beasts were greatly multiplied in the land because there was no man. The environment was unforgiving and hostile, but it was virgin. But when they encountered non-virgin land, they quickly conquered its native inhabitants. They were fearless, and anyone who stood against them were destroyed by them. They were feared greatly by everyone who stood in their path. They took wives of the people around them and had many children. And they that were cast far off became a strong nation. The music of the Bantus involves the rattle, which was used in North, Central, and South America before the Bantu expansion even began. Some tribes even used a 10-string lyre similar to what David played, although the 8-string lyre was more commonly used. The Shona people smoke cannabis from a pipe similar to an indigenous American tobacco pipe. The Shona people also blow into the horn of an antelope, similar to the Hebraic shofar. In a book called The Music of Central Africa, it states that at least one professional philologist considers the Bantu language to be a derivation from the Sumerian language. It also states, the tracing has been based on grammatical as well as vocabulary similarities. Sumerian Banda, little, and Bantu, Isibanda. Sumerian Buru, ear, and Bantu, Buru, or Sumerian Ulili, wailing, and Bantu, Lila. However, I cannot find any evidence that the Bantu language share any similarity to Old Persian. The biblical Persians probably did not speak Old Persian. Old Persian is an Indo-Iranian language and has no similarities to Sumerian, Akkadian, or Babylonian. If the Persians were easily assimilated into the lands of Babylon and Assyria, their language should have at least had some similarities. Biblical Persians probably spoke a language similar to Akkadian. This makes sense because the Persians and the Medes were basically assimilated populations of people who probably spoke a similar or the same language. And we know that the Medes lived in the land of Assyria, which means that the Medes themselves were also assimilated with the Assyrians, and they probably spoke a similar language as well. Lots of Persian documents that we see that are claimed to have been written by King Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, etc. are most likely forgeries to place biblical territories in the Middle East. Indo-Iranian languages are not even related to any Mesopotamian language at all. But anyway, let's look at some Bantu words, specifically some Shona, Zulu, and Xhosa words, and compare them to both Akkadian and Hebrew. Now, I'm not a linguist, and there are very few studies on this, so what I'm going to show you right now is what I could find through my own research. I had absolutely no help, and I'm not going to be able to provide that many words, but I think I did fair enough. Another great piece of evidence would be to compare the Bantu language to the American Aboriginal languages. However, because 90% of the Aboriginal American population of North America were wiped out through disease alone, and the remainder of the Negro American Aboriginals were enslaved and forced to learn English, very few of our languages even still exist. Fortunately, in a separate video, I will discuss the similarities between Eastern Native American languages, Mesopotamian languages, Semitic languages, as well as African languages. Now, all the archaeological evidence indicates that the Bantus migrated out of West Africa into Central and South Africa. Of all the Bantu crops, the oldest breeds of those species are found in the western part of Africa. When it comes to Bantu pottery in Western Africa, the pottery shards are found deeper under the ground in West Africa, indicating that they are older there. When philologists trace derivation of the Bantu languages, they can see that most of the Bantu etymological roots were spoken first in West Africa. Scientists are now considering the fact that Bantus originated in the Western Sahara. The Bantus are known for their unique and revolutionary agricultural practices. The foods a person ate in their life can be determined by detailed analysis of the jaw and teeth of their skeleton. For example, a person who lives an agricultural life will have smaller jaws than a hunter-gatherer would. The teeth and bones will also have less wear and tear. The oldest Bantoid skeleton with agricultural evidence in his jaws was found in the Western Sahara. This is the same thing that I've stated originally. I'm not pulling these details from thin air. Scientists are saying the same thing that I'm saying. The first Bantu showed up on the coast of Western Sahara, then migrated south into sub-Saharan Africa. Again, if the Niger-Congo people and the Bantus claim to have came from Assyria and Persia, how could they have originated from the northwest? Let's get a little bit more information on that claim, by the way. As you can see in this article about the music of Zimbabwe, which was published by another member of the Shona people, not only do they claim to have come from Persia, but they also claim a specific city of their origins called Jerusalem. Of course, this could have been an etymological derivation of the word Jerusalem, or originally Jerusalem. But the Bantus claim that this city is in the Persian region. But as the story of their history passed down from generation to generation for 1,000 years, small details could have been lost. Maybe they were taken from the city of Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, which eventually became Persia, and from Persia they migrated southeast into Zimbabwe. Back in the book, Origins of Rhodesia, page 3, it states, the oral tradition of some Mashona tribes is that they came from a place in the north called Jerusalem. No one is able to say exactly where Jerusalem is. But when we look back at this article, it states that the musical instrument called the mabira originated in this mysterious city of Jerusalem. According to the scriptures, such as Psalms 137 verse 3, one thing the city of Zion was known for was its music. The article also states that there was a second city known as Jerusalem II, which was later established in South Sudan, but through war they were probably driven out and migrated further south into Zimbabwe. The way they describe their migration makes it seem like it was very quick. Well, as we know, the total Bantu expansion took 2,500 years to complete, but the second set of Bantus who traversed the entire continent of Africa, the ones from Persia, seem to have took less than 500 years to complete it. It's quite impressive that they still remember where they came from. The clothing of the Eastern Bantu tells us everything that we need to know about their origins. If they truly came from Persia and Iran, why aren't they dressed like Iranians? Why are they dressed more similarly to Native American Indians? And more importantly, why does archaeological evidence indicate that their ancestors migrated from the northwest, specifically the Western Sahara? It's also clear that the Eastern Bantus had knowledge of sea travel, as they clearly traveled the ocean into Madagascar and probably even as far as Arabia and India. Here are some old Arabic paintings of Eastern Bantus, specifically the Swahilis, sailing the ships into the ocean. So if these people had knowledge of sea travel, why would it be hard for us to consider that they probably originally crossed the sea to get to Africa in the first place? The southern Bantus also used a war club that was very similar to the war clubs used by the northern North American indigenous peoples, which is very strange because they claim to come from Persia, but the people in that area in the Middle East never used a war club with any resemblance to either the southern Bantu or the northern North American Indians war club. So let me just go ahead and debunk the whole 70 AD Roman siege of Jerusalem as the origin of the Israelites in Africa theory. We know that in 70 AD, the Romans did in fact go to war with the people in the southern Levant and exiled many of them into various areas of the east. Many of them did in fact flee into Africa to survive. But DNA evidence suggests strongly that these people were not even Israelites. The people who fled the Levant during the Roman siege of Judea carried haplogroup J and haplogroup E1B1B. Haplogroup J is Japhetic in origin, and E1B1B is our brother Esau. It's evident that many of them fled into the Mediterranean, leading them into Europe and North Africa, also into the southeast, leading them into Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and of course into the southwest, leading them into Egypt and the Nilotic Basin. But as far as the E1B1A peoples, there is no evidence that they migrated from the Levant into their present-day settlements, especially after 70 AD, because there is too much evidence showing for a fact that the E1B1A Niger-Congo peoples have been in Africa far before 70 AD. 70 AD is pretty recent on a historical timeline. If they were to migrate directly from the Levant into their present settlements that recently, their languages would still be strongly Semitic. However, they are not. Niger-Congo and Bantu languages are very diluted and only have little resemblance of Hebrew. Linguistic evidence shows that the Niger-Congo and Bantu languages originated in West Africa, not the East. And if the modern Niger-Congo and Bantu peoples migrated from the Middle East, there will be higher concentrations of E1B1A peoples along the Nilotic Basin, as that would have been the first fertile region that they would have came across. They would have followed the Nile all the way down into Sudan and along the Great Lakes. Their DNA would have been all the way from Egypt down to Tanzania in a straight line from the north to the south. A westward migration into the Sahara Desert would have been discouraged because people with the lack of experience traveling through the Sahara will die, even though in those times the Sahara was a little bit less dry than it is today. But the sheer size of the desert, having sometimes hundreds of miles in between any drinkable water source, is sure enough to kill any person if they're not prepared. The Sahara also has several lakes that may fool you into thinking the water is drinkable, but it is actually so poisonous that you die from ingesting it. Any person unaware of the existence of these lakes will be fooled and end up dead in the desert. Therefore, a mass exodus through the Sahara Desert or even through the Sahel is a death sentence. A westward migration through the Congo rainforest would have also been too difficult. Even during the Bantu expansion, they tried their best to navigate around the rainforest of the Congo into other regions of southern Africa. The fact that the highest concentration of E1B1A is in West Africa along the Atlantic coast shows undoubtedly that they did not originate on the east side of the Sahara or beyond the rainforest. There is no way that the majority of them would have took that deadly journey. Also, we know that the Bantus migrated from the west because in the Congo rainforest there's evidence of ancient slash and burn method agriculture on the western side of the rainforest, indicating that the people from the west attempted to turn the rainforest into farmland on the western side. The Bantu are the only sub-Saharan Africans who use agriculture. The rest of the indigenous people of sub-Saharan Africa are hunter-gatherers. We see very little evidence of this intentional burning of the Congo rainforest on the east side, but there should be a lot more evidence of this agricultural method on the east side if they were to migrate from the east to the west.